Okay, now in this video what we're going to do is we're going to start to plug in the different texture maps that we need to in order to get this jellyfish to achieve its final result. So right now this is what we have. Obviously that's not good, so let's do something about it. Let's open up the material manager here. Here's the jellyfish material. What we need to do is bring in some texture maps. So we can do that here or in the material manager. I'm just gonna do it here. And for the diffuse, we want the diffuse texture to be the color map. So I'll go here and I'll go to image to bring in an actual image here. I'll go to new from file, and what you want to do is go to the pictures directory from this render tree project folder, and what you want to do is look for SSS, and in there you're going to see a folder called textures, and in here will be all the textures you need for this tutorial. So the first texture we want to find is the jellyfish color JPEG. So jellyfish color JPEG, here it is. Let's bring that one. There it is. That's the texture map for the jellyfish. Let me bring back the fast skin shader here. What I'm going to do is pin it down using that little keyhole icon there so it doesn't go anywhere. So now that the fuse has a color map plugged into it, I want to increase the weight to 100%, however, and we're going to start to see how this starts to come together. So let's go ahead and turn off the epidermal scatter layer, and let's go ahead and render this out. So here's what it looks like. Not much of a difference, if at all. What we're going to do is we're also going to plug in the texture map into the overall color multiplier, but we'll do that at the end when we're finished plugging everything else down here. Okay, for the epidermal scatter layer, we have to plug in a texture map in there as well. So let's go here and let's plug in an image. We'll go to new from file, and the image that we want to plug in for the epidermal scatter layer is going to be, if we go here, we'll see jellyfish epidermal JPEG. So open that one up. Now you notice something interesting here. It looks purple. Why does it look purple? Well, it's recommended that you use texture maps for the epidermal layer that look the way that something would look when it's dead, when it's pale dead. When something dies, usually it'll turn, not always, but like a person, for example, will turn very pale purple. So we're going to use this epidermal map to go ahead and plug it in there to balance this thing out, because we can't use one that looks orange or it'll make the overall effect too orangey. So we're going to use this one to balance things out, and you'll see at the end how it'll help. I'm also going to turn the weight up all the way to 1 to 100% so that we get a strong epidermal scatter effect. Now let's render that out and see what we got. Okay, what we have is not very interesting at all. We could see a difference, but again, this is a sort of compositing shader. We have to wait until all the layers are set up before we start to see something that looks good. So now let's do the subdermal scatter layer. Now the subdermal scatter layer is going to have a texture map applied to it as well. So let's go over here, go to image, new from file, and get the image called jellyfish subdermal JPEG. I'm going to plug that in, and this one's got a very orangey look to it, and the reason for that is we want to get that nice gelatin type look underneath the top layer, and even underneath the top layer of the skin or of the material, so we get a nice subsurface scattering effect, and you'll see it work once we turn this all the way up. Let's do a refresh here, see what we got. Okay, so still we don't have much of a difference. So we'll have to wait until we have the backscattering, all the layers set up for this. So here's the backscatter layer. Let's turn the weight all the way up to 100%. And for the backscatter, we're not going to plug in any texture map at all. We're just going to leave it like this. Now let's go ahead and do a refresh and see what we have. Okay, Now we have something more interesting. We have the light transmitting through, and it looks very translucent. Of course, we have to add a little something to this to make it look a little bit better. What we're going to do is we're going to use the same map that's being plugged into the diffuse port and into the epidermal, and we're going to plug that into the overall color multiplier so we don't have this white multiplying everything. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll do that in the material manager. Take the same image node from here, drag it and drop it on top of the fast skin shader, and when it asks you where you want to plug it into the overall color. Okay, so you can see it became a little fleshier, a little more colorful here in the shader preview and the shader ball preview. Alright, and it's plugged in here in the overall color multiplier. So now let's see what we have by refreshing the render preview. Okay, now you see that we have something very interesting. Now it's starting to look more like the final jellyfish. We're starting to see that the color and the texture can be seen more, while at the same time we have a very strong subsurface scattering effect, which is exactly what we were looking for. So now, just to add more detail to this, let's add a bump map. So that's actually going to be pretty simple to do. What we're going to do is go to nodes, go to bump map generator. Let's plug in the bump map generator here to the bump map. Now for the bump map, we're going to go get a new one from file, and we're going to get the JellyFish bump, which should be this one. Yes, it is. And there it is. Now for the bump map generator parameters, let's use -5 so we get a strong bump effect. Okay, hit F6 to clean that up. Okay, so there's our shader network for our jellyfish here. It's actually not as complex as you would think. The complexity is really coming out of this mental ray phenomena shader known as the SSS fast skin shader. It's just jam-packed into a single node with tons of different features and things that allow you to do some cool effects. So here we have the epidermal image plugged into the epidermal layer, the subdermal image plugged into the subdermal layer, and of course the color image is plugged into the overall color multiplier as well as the diffuse color, and also, well, those are the only two that it's plugged into actually. And then the bump map generator is plugged into, of course, the bump map for the material. So let's close the material manager, and we probably won't need this for the time being. And let's do a refresh of this. So now we have our bump mapping taking effect, although it's very hard to see. First of all, it's a very small render, and the anti-aliasing settings are set at very low quality, so we really can't see this in detail. So what we're going to do is, let's close this preview window. I just want to talk about these specular settings really quick. These specular settings control the specularity of the shader. So if you're doing, say, a human character, you can make a person's face look oily, very reflective, or not very reflective and not very oily. It's really up to you. The primary weight or primary specular controls here are going to control the overall, the main specularity of the shader. Now the secondary just adds a secondary layer of specularity to add some more oiliness or more wetness to the surface of the material. And you can use reflection weights to control the amount of reflections in the material in the fast skin shader. You can also set it to render environment only, because when you set this to do reflections by default, it's going to do ray tracing reflections, which take longer to render, so you want to be aware of that. Using environment reflections only allows you to render reflections lightning fast, but of course they're not going to be physically accurate because you're only reflecting an environment map. Okay, and the edge factor here is going to control that incidence that we talked about during the architectural tutorial, where I showed you that perpendicular surfaces reflect more than facing angles. So that's very important to remember. And in the advanced settings, we really don't have much to mess around with here. We have an indirect illumination setting here. So if you're rendering out with final gather, global illumination, that sort of thing. We also have some light map parameters here. This is more for advanced users. If you're really familiar with the way that mental ray phenomena work and the light map works within the skin shader. If not, I would leave these at default, just to make sure that you don't run into any awkward circumstances where things just don't work right. And in miscellaneous, this is a very important setting, the scale setting. The fast skin shader is based off of the size of your scene. So, for example, if you're using a very high scale, it's going to affect directly the way that these parameters work. Also, if you set the scale to very small, it's also in turn going to affect the way that these parameters all work together to achieve the subsurface scattering effect. So you want to be very careful about that. Don't change the scale unless you have to. The default of 1 in our case here for this tutorial worked just fine. In other cases, you may want to increase or decrease it depending on what effect it takes on your scene. Again, each scene is scene specific, so there's really no magic formula that works exactly the same across all scenes. It really depends on the size and scale of the scene that you're working on. So that pretty much does it for this subsurface scattering shader. The only thing that you'll really be left to do is to go here to the render manager, go here to the output, to the width, maybe make this a larger render, so 600, and also change the render settings to 1. And it's actually trying to render right now. So what we can do is change the render settings to 1 and 2 so that it renders at a higher quality and you can start to see more of the detail. So let's hit preview, get a larger render, 600 by 450. Oh, and one thing that I forgot to do, very important. Let's go over here to the JellyFish fast skin shader material, and down here in the light map samples, you want to crank that back up again. 300 really isn't necessary, and I like to keep this at a power of 2, so I'm going to go with 256, which is going to be just fine. And now we'll do a render. Okay, so there's the final high quality render. Render size wasn't too large in order to keep render times down. You can go into render manager though and change the size of the render if you'd like. So there it is. There's subsurface scattering in XSI using the mental ray fast skin shader. I hope you enjoyed learning about the fast skin shader and all the other subjects and topics that we talked about for the duration of this entire tutorial. As much as I enjoyed creating these scenes and teaching you how to do this kind of stuff, it's a lot of fun to me to teach people how to do these things. So I hope you learned a lot, and thanks a lot for watching and supporting i3D. If you got any questions, comments, concerns, or any type of feedback, feel free to drop by our forum and make your voice heard and let us know what you think. So thanks a lot for watching. This is i3D Jack. Take care and have fun in your future 3D projects.